the Honourable Andrew Wilkie's set me up really well. I think my presentation will flow really nicely from the things that Andrew's been talking about. And what I'm talking about today is around realising nurses' contribution to the art and science of healthcare. And it comes really, I think, David heard me talk at the, what is the acronym, David? CONOMO, which is all the nurses coming together in one organisation. But it stemmed from an editorial that I wrote in Collegian in 2015. When I was appointed to the Cancer Council, I knew I had the job, and my registration details came through on the email, and I filled out the form, and I had to tick a box that asked the question of whether I was employed in a job that required me to be a nurse. At the time, I was still in an academic appointment at the University of Melbourne and at Peter Mac in a paid role, so yes, I could tick it. And I was reflecting on, in that editorial, on my professional identity as a nurse and whether that was going to change when I couldn't tick that box anymore. Interestingly, since then the box has changed and you don't have to be in paid employment anymore. But the editorial, you know how you spend your academic life writing articles in the academic press and you do randomised controlled trials and you write them up. I haven't actually ever had any response to any article I've written more voluminous than this particular one. It's been republished in the US and it's created a bit of a storm, but I'll come back to it. So some of the themes I'm going to talk about today are really the nature of what I call the nursing identity problem and how we as nurses contribute to that problem, and to think about how that impacts on our voice and our contribution to healthcare in this country, and why we need to think about changing our professional and public identity. And I'll end with just some random thoughts about how you as individuals might do it, how the APNA might do it, and how we as a broader profession might do it. So I started doing this sort of presentation in 2008 when I did the Vivian Bullwinkle oration for the College of Nursing, when it was, the oration was in Melbourne. And the title of that presentation was Image, Identity and Voice. And it came very strongly out of my PhD, where I'd undertaken work looking at the close relationships that form between nurses who work in cancer and their patients and the taboos about that in the profession, largely around narratives of over-involvement, when what I was really finding in that PhD was that nurses use their involvement with patients to create an environment of healing and well-being that we came to understand as nurturance knowledge, the knowledge of how nurturance actually changes the experience of people. So if you think about the idea, and I'm going to just step through a couple of things from that presentation. So the idea of an image is the likeness or the representation of a person or an animal or a thing, and in this case we're talking about nurses, and that these are really related to the general and public perceptions of how nurses might be thought about. And we can see all sorts of images. This is a fairly typical image that comes out of things like the Crimean War, where when you look at this image, you see a caring professional, but you also see what Siobhan Nelson and Suzanne Gordon have talked about as the virtuous scripts. We are seen as a profession of great virtue. We've got a lot of history involved in religion and the nuns who were nurses. And so this creates both positive and slightly negative perceptions in the minds of the community. But through ICN, we also see nurses globally as being part of a wider story of trying to improve the health of humanity. And in particular, I think this gives us a really important focus on things like inequity and trying to ensure that everyone gets high quality care. Nurses have been talked about as building bridges between particularly around people who are more difficult to love in terms of they come into EDs having been homeless for a while, their toenails don't look too good, and we don't actually treat them as any different to any other person. So this sense of equality. But we also have these images of nursing is not quite so virtuous, and that, I lived in a nurse's home when I trained, and in New Zealand, and there was a lot of this imagery. There was a lot of people sneaking in and out of the nurse's home, and there was always boys hanging around the front door. And this gets also brought into the images. But this is the heart of the editorial that I wrote in 2015. So if you might remember that there was a Miss Universe contestant in the United States who, when she came out to do her special talent, she didn't sing or call for world peace. She talked about being a nurse and her care of patient with dementia and how her work had retained his personhood. The next day, on a show in the United States on television, consisting entirely of female broadcasters, denigrated this nurse for calling nursing her talent. They talked about her as coming out onto stage in a costume, her scrubs, and wearing a doctor's stethoscope around her neck, as if she wasn't a professional in her own right and that this stethoscope wasn't part of the kit. The great thing about some of this particular story was that this television show its major sponsor was Johnson & Johnson, who pulled funding immediately. They lost nearly all of their corporate sponsorship as a show. And the medical profession came out in support. And there was one particular surgeon who talked about the fact that he operated on a patient, but he had that really tiny encounter, and that every other part of that patient's healing, from the point of their admission to hospital and preparation for surgery right through to their discharge and administration, was all executed by nurses, and that he as a doctor couldn't do his job without that, and his patients would not be safe. And there were fantastic cartoons like this. I wish I could find a doctor's stethoscope. All I can find are these nurses' ones. That you can find on Google, and that it really did create something of a debate. So it speaks then to, these images speak to the identity that we have within the public, and the identity is really the sense of self and the condition or character of who a person or what a thing is. So what is our identity as a profession? And so there are lots of things that we see where nurses try to claim identity. This is the fantastic work from Sally Gould and Kerry Ann Little, looking at the story of Black Australian nurses and their contribution to healthcare in this country, which is barely recognised and yet critically important, and we need far more Indigenous nurses than we have. But we see nurses in all walks of life. You see them in the community, you see them in general practice environments, you see them in hospitals and EDs and homes. And so we are everywhere. But there are real questions about how the public see us. Suzanne Gordon, who's an American journalist, has written a lot about nursing, and I'll refer to her quite a bit as we work through. This was an editorial she did in Nursing Inquiry some years ago, so 2000, and I'll come back to this particular editorial again. But the story out of it that I want to start with is that she was walking through Paris, and she walked down the street of Saint-Germain, and she looked into a bookshop, and she saw a series of books called I Know Who Takes Care of Me. I'm not going to try and pronounce it in French. My French is terrible. And it described the doctor, Dr. Gascon, and his ability to be very highly educated and provide for your healthcare, and the physiotherapist, who also had a surname and a Christian name, and her ability or his ability to manage your healthcare. And then it describes the nurse as being not a doctor. The nurse is someone whose studies give her or him just enough knowledge to follow and apply the decisions taken by the doctor or surgeon. And the nurse was Lucille. She didn't have a surname, and that was the way that the book interpreted her contribution. And so this becomes a really important lesson for us in how do we speak about what we do. And when you think about identity, you can go to shows like Grey's Anatomy, and you see a powerful number of doctors on that show. The show's nearly all doctors. There's a few nurses around, but they're usually just there for relationships with the doctors. And Yet, 90% of the work these guys do on the show is nursing work. They wouldn't even be in the video if they were doing medical work. Or they would fleet in as a fleeting character and out again, because that's what doctors do. They are diagnostic treatment machines, but the person who's there by the bedside all the time is actually the nurse, not the doctor. And if they had to write this show around doctors, you wouldn't actually see them. There'd just be vacant spaces. Worse than that, we see Australian shows. Now, I admit that everybody has that thing that they watch. I watch House Husbands. I'm a bit attracted to, I really liked the character that Julia plays, but she's just become a doctor. She used to be a nurse. Why does the show portray a smart, intelligent, really good nurse as achieving something by becoming a doctor? And when I started my PhD, my husband, who's also a nurse, just by the way, said to me, "Why are you doing that? Why don't you just do medicine?" And I was like, oh, it's so frustrating, because we do this to ourselves. We think that somehow we aren't quite good enough. And so to be better, we have to become something else, and in some sort of weird hierarchy, that is to become a doctor. And it is getting more confusing, because medical work and nursing work is becoming more overlaid. So this says, "Hello, Mr. Smith, I'm your nurse Wilton, I'll be your doctor today," and it is getting a little confusing. But most of the time, when that nurse comes in, she just says, "Hi, I'm Jill, I'm looking after you today." And so the patient has no idea whether they're an assistant, a registered nurse, or what in fact they are. And in the editorial I talk about my niece having come out of a 10-hour operation. She was in ICU, she was in pain, and two people came into the ward, and they came up to her bed and they were managing her pain. And she was on a ketamine infusion, and she looked a bit of a mess. And I thought, oh, well, that's the registrar and the resident, maybe, because nobody introduced themselves and they didn't wear anything that was identifiable. But the female of the two said to the male, who I thought was the registrar, "Now, if you just write this, this and this, I'll be able to titrate the medication when I come back." And immediately I knew she was a nurse, because she said to him, "So that I don't have to get you out of bed later on if things go poorly." But it wasn't about getting her out of bed. It was about how she was constructing her ability to provide good care for my niece through, and she was actually the paying nurse practitioner, I found a little later when I hauled her over the coals for not telling me who she was. So, and part of the problem in this identity piece is that we are our own worst enemies. And this cartoon says, "Some of you may have considered choosing a career in nursing. Don't do it, run for the hills." And then it says, "I think we need to find someone else to talk to the kids on career day." But we experience this over and over and over again. And so so what happens is that nurses whose careers take off go into the background. So I still have RN proudly on my business card. I'm very excited that I can stay a registered nurse, and I've just paid my dues. But it's not like that everywhere. And in fact, there are two other registered nurses who are CEOs of the state-based cancer councils, and I've had a go at one of them about the fact that she talks about herself as having a background in health, not that she's a registered nurse. And I think we need an outer nurse campaign. Linda Christensen, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Swinburne University in Melbourne, is a registered nurse, and she and I have been talking about this for quite some time. And the reason I think it's important is when I was at Melbourne University, I amalgamated the School of Nursing and Social Work. That taught me a lot about the difference between nurses and social workers. The nurses had to move into the social workers building. The social workers wanted to have a lot of meetings to talk about how that was going to happen. The nurses just got on and planned the move, moved in, and, "Oh no, we'll just have to talk about that a little bit more. No, we've actually got to be here by next Friday, let's get out of here." And so, but at the dinner for the social work alumni, there was a lot of people stood up in the room proudly identifying as social workers who were no longer working as social workers, but they were out there and they were proud. And I worry that that doesn't happen in nursing. And there were members of parliament and parliamentary secretaries and CEOs of community organisations proudly declaring allegiance to their profession. And I think we let nurses get away with actually proudly denigrating it when they leave. and that's a problem. So that silences our voice. The fact that when nurses do things that are important in our community and don't actually acknowledge that they're nurses, that alters our voice. And our voice gives us the right to present and receive consideration of our opinions. And I think this is what Andrew was talking about, in that the healthcare of this country is actually dictated, or the policy directions are more influenced by medicine than they are by nurses. And this means that we often hear our voice in our strident approaches. I remember walking out of the Royal Melbourne Hospital in the 1986 Stridex being one of the most horrific experiences of my life. And I was on TV and doing things at that time. And in the end, just felt it got us nowhere but a pay increase, which is not what it was about. It was much more about things like nurse-patient ratios. We see people like Tony Cavanaugh, who was the whistleblower in the Dr. Patel case, as actually almost killing herself through that experience. It wasn't until a long way through that experience that she became the hero of the piece. In the beginning, she was the villain. And so our voice is often not heard. And this is, I have to, you can't do a presentation today without a Trump slide. But this is the writing into legislation, the taking away of the funding from the fertility clinics or the family planning clinics, all men. And I think this is an equal representation of what happens at many of the tables of decision making, where the nurse is simply not at the table. And you can't tell here whether they're nurses or doctors, and that's part of it problem, but actually often we are just written out of the conversation, or even if we're in the conversation, we're not heard. I remember the first time I went on a national committee, it was an NH&MRC committee for palliative care research, and my close friend and colleague and former boss, David Currow, who's a professor of palliative medicine, and I were the two sort of clinical experts were brought into this. We're on a teleconference with all the bigwigs in the NH&MRC, and I made a comment about some directions that I thought should happen. David said, I really like what Sanchia's saying, and just expanded it a bit, and then the other people said, let's go with what David's suggesting. And he rang me after and said, were you just written out of that conversation? And it happens all the time. Sometimes we're at the table and we're not heard, and how do we actually change that psyche? So I think that one of the things is that there's some incredible problems with our narratives. And our principal narrative is one of caring. And I'm not here to bash caring, but I think there's some real problems with the way it's described. So this is where the caring work really took off at the University of Colorado under Jean Watson. And you can read through these lists. I'm not going to read through them. But at no point does it really talk about anything other than if you like, an attitude or a set of mind. It doesn't talk about skill, it talks a bit about careful precision and accuracy, but you can do, I remember when you used to have to do procedure manuals, and you could do everything incredibly accurately, but it might still be wrong and not the thing to do. I remember doing incredibly accurate and precise back, pressure area care that proved later to be incredibly wrong. But at the heart of this is actually this sense of the virtue script, that where we come from is actually out of this sense of virtue. And this caring narrative limits it. So it says that we are virtuous women, and so when we're powerful and brainy and clever, that's not consistent with virtuous. It also implies that it's innate, not learned. And you hear people say this all the day, oh, she's a born nurse. That you can't learn, in fact, some skills around this. It also implies it's female. So even for the males in our profession, it's around having these female characteristics. But it also implies that caring action is always good. And we suffer in our profession from something that I've talked about as the tyranny of the warm fuzzy. We do something loving for someone else, and we get a nice glow, and it makes us feel better. And so it keeps this nurturant piece going. But in fact, the thing that we might have done might not have actually helped at all. And I think you can, as a community, if we understand the delivery of healthcare, you can get healthcare that feels as if it's fantastic, but it actually wasn't good for your health. So you can have a lovely surgeon, nurse, organising your surgery, but in fact, that the work we were doing in New South Wales about trying to consolidate pancreatic surgery, if you're having a pancreatectomy in a hospital that does one of those every 4 years, doesn't matter how lovely the surgeon is, you double your risk of dying post-operatively. And so caring action isn't always good. But it's also not understood as skilled practice. And I'm just going to talk a little bit, use one example of where caring worked but wasn't understood. So this is a book called Mum's Marijuana. It's by a guy called Dan Shapiro. He was a writer, and he developed leukemia. He had to have a bone marrow transplant. He actually later married his nurse. I'm not sure what that narrative says. His mother grew vast quantities of marijuana to manage his symptoms, and there's a great photo in the book of Dan standing in this field of marijuana plants that are up around his head. But he's just recovering from his bone marrow transplant, and he's at that point where he thinks, I feel like writing again. So he's sitting there in a nice crisp bed. He's got his pen and his paper, and he's starting to write, and he drops the pen and it hits the floor. And he looks down, he thinks it's the no-go zone down there, that's the dirty bit, and I need to keep clean because I've had a bone marrow transplant. But he thinks, oh, I'm feeling good, so and he reached down to get the pen, and he spilled his urinal all over his bed. And he said this. So he'd gone from feeling very happy, and he said, I felt as if a heavy, suffocating curtain had been dropped on me. In a heartbeat, I went from feeling empowered and optimistic to thoroughly dehumanised. I felt frozen, weary, and beaten down. And in pops the nurse, who made his bed and got him all clean again. He said, with her practiced, gentle style, movements she made hundreds of times a day, she rehumanised me. I'm certain the number of times in my life I moved so quickly between such radical extremes will be counted on one hand. But when I went back to thank her weeks later, she had no memory of the event. She had no understanding of the power of her caring and what it meant to his recovery. She politely acknowledged my thanks and smiled, awkward, looking away, not understanding the passion behind my praise. So this sense is that even when we've got the caring bit of this right, we don't necessarily understand its power. I've done some work with a student called Rosie Brown. This particular one's funny because it says all our nurses now have degrees. Unfortunately, Nurse Pilbright's is in the expressive arts. But we wrote this chapter in one of Suzanne Gordon's books called You Have to Be Clever to Care. The heart of the master's program that Rosie was doing was looking at the management of bodily decline. And it was a reaction to a book that had come out from a sociologist in the UK that had really talked about the fact that when people are dying and they lose control of their physical well-being and their bodies start linking, that it's all pretty disgusting and we should just kill them, really. And that they get locked up in hospices because they need to be contained. And so Rosie went out and did field work in community palliative care, looking at what the physical care was doing. And there were a couple of things that were really striking about her findings. The first was that in this particular community palliative care service, the physical care was seen as not important. And so the district nurses were coming in to do the physical care, and the hospice nurses were going in to do the psychosocial care. And the patients were telling Rosie, well, I've got the talking nurse that comes, I'm not sure what she does. And then there's this other nurse who comes who does all the really good stuff that helps me stay at home and keep me safe and all of those sort of things. And so we'd had this divide. And what was happening was that the psychosocial stuff, the talking, was being privileged over the physical pieces of this particular experience. But there was a particular case that we write up in this chapter that where Rosie was the nurse, the talking nurse, was talking with the wife about her worriness about her husband, who was he'd been incontinent a few times, and he was a little bit mentally not too well, and they were talking about it. So in the meantime, the husband started getting a bit itchy and moving around a bit, and Rosie said, maybe I'll take him to the toilet. And what she discovered, so she walked him to the bathroom, and what she discovered was that he had quite a bit of ataxia. He wasn't really able to get to the bathroom independently. When he got to the bathroom, he couldn't actually take his pants down, and he certainly couldn't manipulate. The bathroom was quite small. He couldn't manipulate the turning around and the sitting down in the seat, and he actually needed assistance to do it. So he wasn't being incontinent because he was losing control of his bladder. He was being incontinent because he couldn't physically get there. But because of his brain metastases, he wasn't actually able to talk and describe what he needed to his wife. And so, Rosie's thought was what they needed was a plan for regular toileting and bringing some capabilities in. But the talking nurse hadn't picked any of that up because she hadn't done any of the clinical care. And what nurses do is we put all this together. We bring all of these things together in some sort of complexity. And it's completely missed. I'm coming back to this editorial by Suzanne Gordon where, in this Necessary Nursing Care article, she talks about the fact that what the nursing component of care, particularly in acute care, but I think increasingly in things like practice incentive payments, nursing is just bundled as this thing, not a separate thing. And she uses the description of a bone marrow transplant being cancelled because there were no available beds. It's not the beds, it's the nurses. The reason you can't admit for a bone marrow transplant is because you haven't got enough skilled nurses to provide the care that those patients need. When beds get shut down in hospitals, we close beds, it's because there aren't enough nurses to look after those patients. And we've got to change this narrative. We actually have to start talking about what we do in completely different ways. Suzanne, you can see I'm a bit of a fan of Suzanne Gordon. She's actually a really eccentric Boston Jewish woman who's quite crazy, but she's really, really clever about nursing. But she'd written about nursing, and I'll talk about one of her books, a lot. And then she had an experience where Kathy Draper, who's a cardiothoracic nurse by background, who's been Dean of University of California in San Francisco for many years, had to have knee surgery and her husband had to be overseas, and so she asked Suzanne to come in and look after her. So she was a day case and then she had to go home. And what Suzanne, they go home, Suzanne gets her out of the car, she goes all dizzy, she falls on the ground, they can't get her up, they get the neighbour, they help to get her up, then they're sort of trying to unlock the front door and Suzanne, and she couldn't actually manipulate the crutches even though she was a nurse and she'd used crutches before, she couldn't get up the steps, they had to get somebody else to help them up the steps. And she was in real danger of falling over again. And then she had a couple of other falls through this week. And Suzanne writes in this editorial about how completely devastated she was, that she thought she knew about nursing and she knew nothing. And she says, because to think like a nurse, you actually have to be one. You can't do this. That what you're doing is that you have a particular gaze on a situation that we don't even know we have, but we're putting... If you'd been the nurse, what you'd have done is left Kathy in the car, you would have gone and unlocked it. You'd probably, if it was a long path, have put a chair somewhere along the way so she could have a bit of a rest on the way. You would have thought differently about the whole scenario than if you weren't a nurse. And Suzanne says we've got to start really understanding that because Suzanne had a bit of a go at the discharge nurse from the day surgery unit after this event when she rang the next day to ask how Kathy was. And Suzanne said, well, you didn't prepare me for this at all. And it would change, if we thought like this, if we could articulate what it is that we've got that's innately in our brain about this nursing gaze, then our discharge instructions would be completely different. The way that we prepare the person who picks the patient up for day surgery, or if you've got somebody coming into your community practice who's come out of hospital, you would think differently about how you prepare. But this stuff is so embedded and ingrained in our embodied knowledge, we don't know how to talk about it. And so I think that what it is, we've talked a lot in nursing about being empathetic, but I actually think what we need to start talking about is how we develop a therapeutic imagination. That in every situation, what we're actually doing is imagining the scenarios that might go on in a particular situation. I see nurses do this all the time, but they're doing it automatically and they aren't able to articulate it such that others can see that it happens. And I think a therapeutic imagination is a really necessary thing. So this is the first book that Suzanne actually wrote about nursing. It's called, I'd highly recommend it to you. It's called From Silence to Voice, What Nurses Know and Must Communicate to the Public. Because this comes back to, this came out of another piece of work she'd done on the Just a Nurse campaign. Because I even find myself doing it. What do you used to say? What do you do? Well, I'm a nurse, or I'm just a nurse, as opposed to saying I'm a really skilled health professional with a lot of education, and what I do is I keep people safe, I help them to self-manage their own care, a different set of language. And this book really helps you to understand how you might go about doing that. We had Suzanne at Peter Mac for about a week, and we did some work with nurses trying to get them to describe what they do. And it was really interesting, in particular in haematology, where the nurses would, when they first start to tell a story of a patient encounter, they use a narrative of caring. Well, I look after this Joan, I care for them. They use very caring, emotive language. And then when you work through a particular scenario, you can get them to talk about the fact that the ways that they're picking up really subtle changes that might indicate infection, and how they actually keep patients safe from overwhelming sepsis, and how that links to overall survival. And I think that this working through some of the processes that she suggests really help us to do that. And so I guess in closing, what is it that you might do as an individual nurse to really begin to just change a little bit? I'm not asking you to completely shift who you are or what you do, but I think there's some things that we can do just daily to do this a bit differently. The first thing is to claim your territory. Be able to speak about what your practice encompasses and what you actually deliver to patients. And don't put it down or make it ordinary, because the minute you just say that it's ordinary, you put it into this notion of being innate. So learn to speak about your practice in some quite specific ways. So I think if you can describe what you do and the difference you make, do it at the barbecue. Find your 30-second soundbite that when somebody says to you, what are you? You don't say, I'm just a nurse, and kind of downplay it. Actually find an example. The sorts of things that I do in my work every day are like this, so that you can get asked. Or when you're in the lift with the Honourable Member for Denison, you can say, Minister, what would really make a difference, or Member, what it would really make a difference is X. Nicola Roxon taught me, she's chairman of my board, taught me that you need the elevator pitch, the sound bite that you can use to really describe what you do and what you need to make a difference. I've been sitting on the MBS review task force for the Oncology Committee, and the spectacular failure of that process to actually recognise that a few MBS items for nurses might actually make a huge difference in terms of cost savings to this country. There's one item in the oncology list that's called, that's claimed by doctors. I think it's about $200 million worth of expenditure a year. That item is flushing a central line. Hands up, anyone who's seen a doctor flush a central line? No, never. It's a nursing item that is claimed by medicine, and then nurses get a payment off it in a practice. And it's a big item. That's a big amount of money. But if we could have that $200 million to spend on Medicare items for nurses, we'd have something pretty big. So and take opportunities to learn from others. I think one of the things nurses do is we don't often put ourselves into situations where we can actually watch the skill of how others advocate and lobby for change, and make sure that if you get an opportunity to join a community committee or get yourself in a situation where you can watch change happening. You don't have to be a full participant in the beginning, just watch others. That's how I've learned a whole lot of what I do, is by actually putting myself in situations that give me experiences that make me feel uncomfortable. And out of that, you learn heaps. But as a profession, the really important thing we have to do is demand a seat at the table. And we're often not at it. We're not even seen. Just recently, I've been mentoring the head of the Cancer Nursing Society of Australia, because the government announced the new advisory council for Cancer Australia, and there's not a nurse at the table. I'd been on the council for 8 years. I wasn't, and the excuse is, it's all about individuals. Nobody's a representative. I'm saying you're talking about 50% of the cancer workforce, and they're not at the table of the government's cancer control organisation. What is that? If that happened in medicine, there would be outcry. But we write a polite letter and we get a polite response, and it's not corrected. And I think it's a huge problem. You contribute to the evidence of the impact of nurses by being able to talk about what you do. If you get an opportunity to talk as part of a research project or participate, help to build the evidence base, because it's really lacking. I think it's really important that as a profession we begin to work more effectively with the media to change representations of nursing and nursing work. Be proactive as an organisation to get positive nursing stories into the press. And importantly, as a profession, we need to speak up when you notice nurses are being omitted. As president of UICC, so since that bio, before I've actually taken up my presidency, I was asked to do the foreword for this document, Women as Change Agents in Oncology, which is a document that was funded by Roche, but it contains about 10 stories of influential nurses and women in oncology. And I got I agreed to do the foreword, and I got the copy, and there wasn't a nurse in it. It's about global cancer control. There was a psychologist, there was a radiation oncologist, a medical oncologist, a surgeon, there was a laboratory scientist. I said, I'm sorry, I can't write your editorial. I can't do the foreword, there's no nurse in here. And everybody said, you can't do that. I said, yes, I can. I actually have to make a stand for the fact that you have just omitted 50% of, well, in many parts of the globe, a far higher proportion of the workforce than here. And they actually said, well, if you can find me a nurse leader, we'll put one in. And my trusty friend Julia from Africa, who's a British nurse who works in palliative care in Africa, graciously, rapidly produced something, and she's in the publication. But we have to not be silent. We have to break the silence and start to really claim the contribution we make to healthcare in this country and around the globe. Thank you very much. Oh. I forgot the punchline. Does anybody know this joke that talks about the husband that comes home every day and says to his wife, what is it that you do all the day? And this is the picture of the day he comes home, and he said, what happened? She said, I didn't do it today. And I think this is what would happen. This is an illustration of nursing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here today.